Well, thank you for coming. I'm Joshua Nossiter. I'm a Dartmouth 79. And every once in a while, I come back to campus, which I am always looking for an excuse to do, to introduce the speaker in the Nossiter Nieman guest lecture series. We started this series back in 2000 in memory of my dad, Bernard D. Nossiter, who was a class of 47, and whose year as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard probably was the best year of his life. I don't know if Karin is feeling the same way, but it's a pretty sweet deal. And these lectures are made possible by the hard work of Joanne Needham here at the Rockefeller Center. She's maybe somewhere in the room. Joanne, wave, thank you. Sadhna Hall, also of the Rockefeller Center. And I want to thank Professor Emeritus, which kind of amazes me that you're a Professor Emeritus of Classics, Edward Bradley, and Professor Emeritus of History, Michael Ermarth, who have been staunch supporters of these lectures since they started. Edward reminds me that the Nossiters have a Russian connection of their own. My dad, when he was London bureau chief of the Washington Post, one of his sources was the KGB chief in London. And they would play tennis regularly. And not surprisingly, the KGB guy's game was all spin. Also, here's my son, Jason Nossiter, who was here for the first lecture given by John Kenneth Galbraith back in the day. And the two of us were in Ronner Special Collections Library this morning looking at my dad's old papers, which he donated to the college years and years ago. So among the things that we came across were issues of the Daily Dartmouth from 1979, my graduation year. And Jason spotted a story about General William Westmoreland, who came to campus and told the students the Vietnam War was lost because of the press, which we now know is the enemy of the people. Lying public officials are not new. They've been with us since the dawn of time. It's probably true that the tone of contemporary lying officials is unprecedented in its malignancy and viciousness and shamelessness. It's the kind of thing that my dad, who had a pugnacious nature, would have fought against tooth and nail, but calmly. Among the other things that we found among his papers was an address he gave, a commencement address, to the American School in London class of 1978 high school. So that would have been my younger brother's graduation year. My younger brother, Adam, who is now a Paris correspondent for the New York Times and has been covering the French elections with great glee. So we found this commencement address, and I won't read you all of it, but I'll read you the very end because it seems very salient, not only to contemporary events, but also to the topic at hand. And so Dad told those American students in London, and they were mostly American then, H.L. Mencken once advised reporters that the only proper way to look at a politician was down. Not a bad beginning. Indeed, you might consider whether looking askance with wide eyes and active mind is not the proper way to examine any person or idea in power. Remember that, like politicians, the life of any authority is limited. But some of you may complain, if we critically examine every proposition, take apart every system of belief, reject all authority, except that which experience and observation confirm, what is there left? What can we live by? An answer was supplied by the late Morris Cowan of CCNY, who each year gave a course in the great Western thinkers and carefully demolished them one by one. On the last day of his course, a student would invariably cry out, "Dr. Cowan, you've destroyed all the great systems. What do you offer instead?" And Cowan would reply, "It is not recorded that Hercules was required to do more than clean out the Augean stables." The convention calls for a peroration now, a summing up, a bit of advice from me to you, a Polonius-like discourse. I could, of course, say, beware recipes, shun easy formulas, trust little except your own judgment, a judgment based on that most splendid of all combinations, experience and study. But of course, I'll not say any of those things. You would immediately and properly spot me as a hypocrite, contradicting my own themes. Instead, I'll suggest a stance as you leave here, slightly on the defensive, on the balls of your feet, able to shift quickly to the left or to the right, backward or forward, hands loosely held at your side, ready to grasp, equally ready to repel. Skepticism, suspicion, wariness are not in the heroic mode, but in an age of anti-heroes, they may serve better than some more striking conventions. Heroic skepticism has been practiced by our speaker, Karin Pettersson, throughout her long and distinguished career as a journalist. She is the political editor of Sweden's biggest daily, and I'm told I'm pronouncing this correctly by saying Aftonbladet. She's come here to pick up the theme that my father was on about 40 years ago. Karin, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind and humbling introduction. I'm very, very honored to give this year's Bernard de Nossiter's lecture. And as was mentioned, I am this year a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and it is indeed and has been the best year of my life. I would like to talk to you today about journalism and what it feels like to almost, but not quite, give up. But first, I would like to tell you briefly about my two grandfathers. Just for those of you who might not know where Sweden is. I know this is an Ivy League school, but anyway. I'm from Sweden. It's a small country in Northern Europe. It's a stable, actually let me go back. It's a stable, prosperous, progressive country. And if you wonder sometimes why Europeans freak out when your president talks about maybe not wanting to support NATO anymore, consider that the fact that my summer house is on this small island in the Baltic Sea called Gotland, an island that in most scenarios where Russia becomes just a little bit more aggressive and decides to take back some or all of the Baltic states, is immediately becomes occupied. Anyway, my father was the first person in his family to go to university. He comes from a family of poor, struggling, small-time farmers in Sweden. His father, Emil, on this picture, grew up in poverty and died at the age of 66 of tuberculosis. I never saw him. I never met him. My grandfather, on my mother's side, Gunnar, as a very young man, went to fight as a volunteer in the Finnish War for Independence against Russia. It was called the Winter War, and it was fought at the beginning of the Second World War under terrible circumstances, and he never talked about it. He later made a career as an officer and worked for the Red Cross and the UN. And just to remind you again, Finland, Russia. I knew my grandfather, Gunnar, as a fierce and argumentative man, very conservative, hating the values that I've since spent my life fighting for, and most of the things that progressive Sweden is about. I loved him very, very much, and I named my son after him. This is the last picture that I have from him. It's from the celebration for giving my son his name, and also, as I said, the last picture of my grandfather who died just a couple of weeks later. When Gunnar was very old, I learned that as a young officer in the 1930s, he had been a sympathizer with Swedish right-wing movements close to the Nazis. My family never talked about this fact. I'm telling you this story because I think about both my grandfathers these days, when nativism and right-wing extremism is on the rise, and Europe's history in a way comes back to haunt us. Poverty and real hardship, even in my peaceful and prosperous part of the world, is just a couple of generations away, and nationalism and fascism has been there all the time, biding its time under the surface. So what about journalism then, and giving up, and how is all of this connected? Back in Sweden, my job is, as was mentioned, the political editor-in-chief of Aftonbladet, Scandinavia's biggest daily newspaper. I have a long background in journalism. Politics is my passion. 10 years ago, I started Sweden's leading news magazine. I spend my days writing, reading, debating. Here's me and my daughter Eva, who in periods sees me too much on TV and too little at home. My day job is to run the editorial page of my newspaper. In my case, that's an editorial page which is left-leaning, pro-migration, pro-feminist. I love a good debate and an intense fight. Otherwise, I wouldn't have signed up for this job, obviously. But the last years, the public discourse has broken down completely in Sweden, even in this peaceful part of the world. It has been a time, as you know, of surging right-wing populism all over Europe, and in my country as well. In Sweden, these forces have been channeled through a party with some well-known characteristics. It's a political movement that has tapped into racism, male chauvinism, and fear of refugees, especially Muslims. It's a political movement that has built its own media operation, supporting its policies. And it's a movement that took the pundits by complete surprise in the last election. I'm guessing parts of this sounds familiar to you. In my country, this party is called the Sweden Democrats. They have their roots in the neo-Nazi movement and are now the third biggest party in parliament. This is their party leader, Jimmie Åkesson. In the last years, the wars in Syria and Iraq led to a refugee crisis of, you have to say, epic proportions in Europe that has energized these parties. Sweden was the European country who accepted most refugees as a proportion of its population. This came with a price, a political price, in terms of the surging in the polls of this party. And I would just like to reflect for a moment when we're talking about the refugee crisis, because I think politicians and pundits and maybe other people as well often talk about world events from a macro perspective. We talk about migration flows or masses moving back and forth. But politics is really always about people. And I would like to tell you the story of this girl whose name is Fatima and whom I met at a refugee shelter in Sweden a couple of years ago. Every night she dreamt that she was falling from a ship. Her story was that she had fled from the city of Idlib in Syria with her mother and her two siblings to escape the terrible violence of the Assad regime. After 2 years in a settlement in Lebanon, the situation became unbearable and they fled to Libya, where they boarded eventually an overcrowded boat. On the deck of the boat, Fatima saw a pregnant woman giving birth to her baby after 12 hours in the scorching sun. The baby was stillborn and was thrown overboard. Fatima saw everything, and when her boat started to sink, she and the rest of the people on the boat were in the last minute picked up by the Italian Coast Guard. And this is the background of her dream that she had, her recurring dream of falling from the ship. And I'm telling you this story because, yes, we live in a time of transition and dramatic changes, a time of migration, of globalization, and technological disruption. It is in many ways a perfect storm that we see. And I don't believe that there are any easy answers to these challenges. I found this picture. It kind of reflects my feeling about the now. My passion is journalism, but I am an economist also by training. And when we talk about what's happening, I think that we both as journalists and as citizens need to understand that what's going on is part of a larger story, and then we need to sometimes zoom out to really understand what's going on. It's about the personal, the individual, but it's also about the bigger picture. And I think we have to remember some of the basic economic facts of the time we live in. It's about exploding inequalities, of massive technological disruption, challenging both old institutions and, I think, equally important, identities and the way of life for many people. The migration crisis in Europe, for example, didn't happen in a vacuum. It took place against the backdrop of almost a decade of economic stagnation in my part, as well as here in the US, following the financial crisis. And that's just the short-term story. The longer trend is, of course, sorry, I had to have one graph. The longer trend is, of course, that inequality is exploding in the West, and that the social contract as we knew it in the post-war era is now falling apart. On a global scale, of course, this picture is again different. In Asia, we see the emergence of a new global middle class. But for our societies, the picture is clear. The rich are getting insanely, I would say perversely rich, and the middle class is stagnating, and the poor are falling behind. And I believe that it's important to understand that the rise of populism is, in a way, a rational response to this increased inequality, and also to the failure of both the left and the right to articulate credible policies that actually challenge this state of affairs and create hopes for the many. The point I want to make here is that the problem of the disrupted public discourse isn't really about fake news and lies. It's about the demand for fake news and lies. The despair and the distrust that drives that demand. At the same time, and very much connected to this economic disruption, we live in a time of technological upheaval that fundamentally challenges how we communicate and interact with each other. It's also part of this perfect storm. Those new ways of interacting and communicating has major flaws. Let me make a very simple point to illustrate what I mean. The year before coming here to the US on this wonderful fellowship, and I'm so grateful for that, I almost gave up my job. I gave up on fighting. Almost gave up on journalism. Because for me, this, on a very personal level, the result of this political environment that we were talking about and the rise of the right-wing extremism was that every morning my inbox was filled with hundreds of emails with hatred, threats of killing me, of hurting my children, and of so-called facts. Muslims are terrorists, they hate women, they will destroy this country, you deserve to be raped by immigrants. That's a very typical email that I would get by the hundreds weekly. And don't get me wrong, I've been reporting on the right-wing movements and right-wing extremism for a long time. And I know they're very good at propaganda. The content they produce looks like news, and their stories are shared widely on social media. But of course, they don't have anything really in common with real journalism. The information they choose to publish is cherry-picked, the imagery is racist, and the stories that don't fit in will never become published. But not everyone reads these stories or trusts what they're saying. A lot of people actually want to find information for themselves. or just double check if the facts in the link that their friend posted on Facebook is correct. So they go to Google, our modern day library, most people's only entry point to finding information or facts. So I want to just show you this picture, which is in Swedish, and I will translate it. So this is what people find when they type in the search Muslims are in Swedish in the Google search engine as of last week. So the search results that will show up is Muslims are oppressors of women, Muslims are oppression of women, Muslims are terrorists, Muslims are the greatest threat to this country. I had my husband and my friends do the same search, and they got very similar results. As I said, I have been reporting on right-wing movements for a long time. I know that they have been building their so-called news sites and propaganda networks for years. I know that they're good at optimizing search results and search ranking for the words and phrases they want people to see. And don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming Google for the rise of right-wing extremism. As I said, my personal belief is that the rise of populism is, to a large degree, a reaction to these much larger trends in our economy. But I do believe that the information infrastructure that we are building and that we are now living with have major weaknesses that are contributing to the undermining of both journalism and democracy if we don't do anything about it. 10 years ago, most of the thinkers of the internet believed that yes, it would disrupt the media, but it would at the same time lead to more control and influence in the hands of individuals. Since most of these thinkers came from the libertarian or progressive side of politics, they saw this as an opportunity for like-minded to organize, to challenge central authorities and economic power centers. The story was that the emergence of the internet and the principles of the open web that initially underpinned it would take control from the few, transferring it to the many. It was, at its core, a democratizing technology, helping Barack Obama being elected president, ushering in the Arab Spring. That was the story of the internet. Since then, unfortunately, many things have changed. What happened instead, as we know now, is that the internet is moving from open to closed, and that control ended up in the hands of 2 or 3 companies that completely control our access to information. My search result for Muslims are is just a small example of the power these companies are and how they lack in transparency. No publisher in the history of journalism has ever enjoyed the same kind of influence over the news consumption of the world. And this happens at the same time as we see these economic disruptions. And not only do they control the way we communicate, their business model is to suck up all digital advertising that finance the people that actually produce real journalism. And I'll explain this picture. In their latest report, the TOE Center for Digital Journalism tells the story of how exactly a year ago thousands of engineers and executives crowded into the Facebook developer conference in San Francisco. On stage, the founder of BuzzFeed and one of the co-founders of Facebook discussed the best examples of what works on the social web and how publishers and journalists should think about content, as it's called nowadays, to optimize money made from distributing their news on Facebook. The answer, as it turned out, was 2 BuzzFeed employees placing rubber bands around the watermelon until it exploded on Facebook Live video. At its peak, this watermelon experiment had a live audience of 807,000 simultaneous views. This was presented as a new opportunity for publishers in this new to use this new information infrastructure. To put this very bluntly, first, these guys destroy the business model for the one part of society that is supposed to inform the public and safeguard against corruption and abuse of power. Then their algorithms undo the work journalists do with fewer and fewer resources. Because does it really matter if we report the truth and when people want to double check what they find on Google, they still run into lies and propaganda? I am giving you a very bleak picture here, but I think it's important sometimes to extrapolate and give radical examples of what's actually happening. And finally, in my view, these companies refuse to take responsibility for the things that they are indeed wrecking. And this is part of this perfect storm. Yes, it's about economic disruption, but it's also about these weaknesses in the information infrastructure and about they are being used by the enemies of liberal values. Let me give you another example of how this works. On February 18th this year, President Trump said in a speech that Sweden is having problems like they never thought possible. At first, Swedes laughed. They thought it was funny to be mentioned by this guy that most Swedes don't respect. Sweden's former Prime Minister Carl Bildt asked on Twitter, "What has he been smoking?" But this story really is more depressing than funny. As it turned out, the night before, as some of you know, Trump had watched a Fox News segment that depicted Sweden as a war zone, being torn apart by an apocalyptic crime wave caused by Muslim refugees. There was only one problem with the president's source of information. The statistics were wrong, completely wrong. It was fabricated by right-wing propaganda sites. The Fox segment that Trump had watched is a carbon copy of the image of Sweden that right-wing extremists in my country and the Sweden Democrats have peddled for a long time. It's important to understand two things about how this type of propaganda works. First, the information networks of the far right are global and well-funded, as opposed to all other political movements that today seem to mostly engage in infighting. The editors, content producers, and politicians in charge, they know and learn from each other. It's a real global network, very well functioning. Secondly, the content they produce is created for two very specific purposes: to foster racism and then secondly, to undermine democratic institutions. More specifically, they want to portray journalists as enemies of the people, just as we've heard President Trump do. Because of that, if that succeeds, the road to a more ambitious dismantling of liberal democracy becomes easier. Add to all this the fact that there are clear ties between Russia and the disinformation campaigns from the extreme right in Europe. It makes sense since these players share the common goal of destabilizing democratic institutions in the West. But it makes the level of irresponsibility from politicians riding this wave of propaganda even more shocking. This year, I've spent thinking hard about what creates this new environment, this challenge for journalism, and what my own role is going forward. And I've been thinking about, as I said, my two grandfathers and the forces that shaped them. It was poverty, it was the longing for a better life, and it was also the dangerous ideas of the 30s. Our time is so different, but it's also so similar. I strongly believe that journalism in itself can never fix populism. Only people creating movements and pushing politicians to do better can do that. And that's really a job for all of us. But traditional media needs to reorient, not by developing better viral content and clickbait, but by recognizing that it is operating in a propaganda and disinformation-rich environment. That part is new. We will have to fight to defend basic principles of our profession, but we will also have to fight for fundamental values. And I think we have to put pressure on these information giants that are now monopolizing how we communicate with each other, to become more responsible and more transparent. Otherwise, it won't matter how good a job journalists do. I'll end with this picture of Emmanuel Macron, the new president of France, just to build in a little bit of feel-good and hope. Not because I actually particularly like him. I think his policies are potentially too weak and too centrist from my perspective. And the risk is, of course, that Macron's term of office is followed by a new wave of disappointment from voters. But the point he very importantly made in the second round of the French election is that there is no determined trajectory. There is no law saying that this is the time of right-wing populism and that it's destined to succeed. I became myself politically active and aware in the 90s after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I strongly believed then that the story of my grandfathers, the poverty, the economic disruption, the dangerous ideologies that my grandfather adhered to was part of history, not part of now. I thought we had, we were done with that. When I started out in journalism, I wanted to write about healthcare, taxes, public finances. Yes, it's true. It's all true. I wanted to write about public finances. This epic fight and this fight for this perfect storm and fight for fundamental values, it's not what I expected. It's not what I signed up for. But this is, I guess, the fight that we got, all of us. And I'm thinking at least it's a good fight. So thank you for having me. And if you want to talk about European politics, economics, the media, Sweden, bring it on.
Thank you for a very sobering but necessary talk. Earlier on, you mentioned the rise of the right in Sweden, and I did not happen to catch you, and you may have mentioned it. Some of the problems of our right, particularly in our Rust Belts, exportation of jobs and the technology, taking over other jobs. Is this an element in Sweden as well, or is it less of an issue than perhaps northern France, for example, hits it, and certainly in our Middle West? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I think. Obviously, the differences are huge between our countries in terms of social security nets, in terms of how the economy is structured, and so on and so forth. I think when you look at who votes for these parties, the demographics are fairly similar. It's not the very poorest part of the population. It's the part of the population who either have lost their jobs or live in fear of losing their jobs. And they're predominantly male. And I think that plays into it as well, because I think losing, or in this post-industrial society that we're moving towards, a lot of jobs that were connected to male identity and were regarded as good jobs, specifically for men, are now disappearing everywhere, also in my country. So I think some parts of the story is similar, and some parts of it is obviously different. We also have very different election systems. So I guess since the support for the Sweden Democrats in the Swedish polls is now at about 17 or 18%. So it's high, but it's unlikely that they would gain in the near future, the post as prime minister without collaborating with someone else. Thank you.
I can't remember the man's name. He's a computer scientist at Stanford who won the Turing Prize. It's Thomas something with a hyphenated name. He won the Turing Prize, and he gave an address in which he said when he started out this work on the web and the internet and the web, he thought it was going to be a source of great good and positive positive direction for humanity, the empathy, charity, cross-cultural understanding, the exchange of, goodwill and all that. And he said it turned into a Pandora's box. Now, if you spend your lifetime coming up with phrases that resonate in this kind of techno-messianic way about we're going to change the world through technology, which is the idiom of the present, and you talk about thinking outside the box, well, maybe it is a Pandora's box, and maybe you need to think a little bit more about the longer term effects of the technology. And maybe when you think about technology and connectivity and all of that, your first impulse, because you're probably a well-meaning human being, is to think about the good effects and to sort of neglect the counter effects. And now we're getting this blowback, all the trolling, the anonymity of it, the malevolence, and our own president does it, not anonymously, attributably. But it's like I sort of do wonder about the role of technology in this kind of unthinking need to have some kind of like redemptive process going. Because the technology maybe is wonderful for, as they say, Davos man and maybe Davos woman, but it isn't great for people losing their jobs to automation and robotics and all that others, including automated cars, automated trucks. What are we thinking when we think that technology is the answer?
It's a big question, but I would like to. It's interesting with this shift that you're talking about, because I was doing a podcast with Yochai Benkler, who's a Harvard law professor and one of the thinkers about the internet. He wrote a book that came out 11 years ago where he was very optimistic about what he called the networked public sphere. And this is what I mentioned earlier in the speech, where he's basically saying that, yes, we will see a disruption, but the power will move away from these media companies to the many. And when I interviewed him now and asked, so what do you think now of the things you wrote 11 years ago? And he said, I could never imagine that these possibilities would be hijacked by these political forces. In my mind, I believe that liberals or progressives would be better at using this technology. So it's also a lack of imagination, or kind of lack of, I don't know, it's an optimistic mind. Maybe we all live in these bubbles where people around us are like ourselves, and we have a hard time imagining people thinking very differently about these possibilities. And to your larger question about the role of technology, I'm just a simple journalist. I do believe that we live in a time of real disruption, and it worries me a lot. And I've been taking a class this last semester with Danny Roderick, who is an economist specialized in globalization, and he's been talking a lot about the naivete of politicians, specifically to your question about trade and global trade and how it's connected to jobs, and how the political system never was able to compensate the losers of these larger shifts, these larger trends, and never had an idea, never had a real idea. Because it's not only about money, it's not only about compensating people in terms of giving them a check, it's also about identity and place in community, and what's the political answer to that? I guess that's the bigger question.
I wonder if I could follow up on your mention of Danny Roderick. And it raises the question about what is Sweden actually doing? Sweden that has this sort of gold standard social network. And how is Sweden looking at its social network in light of the changes that are coming, are happening, and what is being envisioned in a modern, or what we thought was a modern society like Sweden?
So I think you could argue that there's broad political support from the left to the right in Sweden for social services, at least healthcare, and we've had a period of 8 years with conservative governments that kind of scaled down some of the social security nets. But I mean, compared to other countries, they're still on a very high level. The big discussion that we're having now in terms of, in the light of the migration crisis and the inflow of refugees, is about the labor market. Should we change how our labor market works and allow for a bigger sector of low-skilled workers, essentially living, earning much less than the average, or than low-paid workers today earn in Sweden? Because that would, in a way, change the whole structure of our society, which is very much based still on equality, especially compared to other countries. So the big and difficult debate that we are having right now is whether we should move towards more of an Anglo-Saxon, I would say, model on the labor market. I think it's unlikely, but that's the big and difficult debate right now. But I think that there's still very broad support for, the fundamental for social security and high that are publicly financed and that are accessible to all, because we've lived with them for such a long time. So it's hard for anyone to be elected on a program that would remove that, I think.
Which one? You say it's a time to fight, and my question is how? My first priority, I think, is to try and talk to people on the other side, but I'd like to hear what you think the best way to fight is.
So I think you should, what I mean by that, and that's a good question, what I mean by that is that I, as a journalist, cannot fix this, the rise of populism. It's not my job. And I have to live with a reality where not everybody will like the work I do, because we have this polarization also in terms of where and how people access their information. And there will be a large minority, even in my country, who just doesn't believe in mainstream media or in the old institutions, but that believe these alternative media universes and the lies they spin, honestly. And it's a new, I was talking to Joey Ito, who is the head of the MIT Media Lab, and it's a great thinker about the internet, and he's also on the board of the New York Times, and he said, journalists have to understand that they are not only reporting on the battle anymore, they are also journalists are, and news organizations are to a large extent, the battlefield today. We are players in this game because of the propaganda that is being spun by state actors, by political parties. It's not as simple as it was to just say that I stand on the sidelines and I report, because people will try to influence you, people will hate you to a much larger degree than before, and the polarization that exists in the world of politics has also reached the world of media. So, and I think this is just something we have to live with and not give up on our standards and not give up on our values. So that's what I mean. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah? No?
Well, I think it's an answer for you, but is it an answer for us?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's a universal answer.
I like very much your citing income inequality, the egregious shifts that have taken place in the course of the past 40 years as being perhaps a catalyzing force for so much else, including the demand then and the appetite for false news. the socialist candidate in the recent French presidential elections, I thought made a noble stab at representing a party that has fallen apart, but above all in his proposing that there be a guaranteed minimum income for everyone. Is that a way to begin addressing this question in your judgment?
Oh, I love that question. I don't think so. I think it's an interesting proposal. It's an interesting idea. But I think the way we still structure our societies, so much of our values and identities are connected to work. I don't think you can just do away with that in, over a couple of years. I do think we need to think about ideas like job guarantees or other types of inclusionary policy measures, but just going from a world where your identity is so much defined by what you do to saying that you guys, we're just going to give you money and you can do whatever you want. And in societies which are so polarized, where people don't even have the means maybe to know what they want to do with that free time, to be able to, explore creativity or whatever the dreams about this is, I think those are my reasons for not believing in it. I know actually, and this is interesting, that some of these libertarian thinkers in Silicon Valley like this idea, because what they have discovered is that if this trend continues with the a lot of people in this country being too poor, not enough people will be able to, buy their stuff. So it's a way of paying people to watch ads and then, on Facebook, and then buying some of the stuff they see. That would be, some of these people think, a good way forward. That's not my dream society.
Thank you for, is this working? Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for a really interesting talk. You said earlier today that, I have a two-part question. It seems like you were talking about having to change the wage scale in Sweden to accommodate this influx of refugees who might be lower skilled. But I thought you said earlier today that actually it's a good process for Sweden over the long haul, because a lot of these Syrian and Iraqi refugees are very well educated. And then my second question is different, but it's really about how long it's been that Sweden has been facing these very, very violent Nazi sympathizers who've been attacking journalists and giving them death threats. You and I were talking about Stig Larsson and how he was facing death threats, 15, 20 years ago. So those are two very different questions, but I was wondering if you would talk about them.
Sure. So we had a discussion with some students today about the economic effects and social impact of this refugee influx. And this is, of course, a highly debated question, but I will try to give a fair answer. And so, of course, this comes with social costs, and it puts a lot of pressure on education. We had 2015 and 16, especially 15 was the record year. We had 160,000 people seeking asylum in a country of a little less than 10 million. So it's a massive influx of people, and of course it puts a lot of pressure on our education system, on housing, on social services, on healthcare, on all of that, which is problematic in the short term. And I was arguing, and I think some but not all economists in Sweden would agree with this, that if you think about this on 10 or 20 year or even 30-year perspective, these people who arrived in Sweden are young. They're in a productive age. Many of them are children. So in a time where most European countries have a problem with demographics, with aging populations, if you think about this just, on the medium term, or especially on the long term, I think this will be highly advantageous to Sweden if we manage it correctly and see to that people actually get a chance to, be part of our societies. But we have big problems in Sweden with segregation, and also a long history of being a very homogeneous society, which makes it not easier. So that was the argument I was making. And the other question was, we've had these small, very violent, very dangerous neo-Nazi, to the far, far, far right on the political spectrum, organizations for a long time. And we've had at least one murder of a journalist. That was 15 years ago. But a lot of journalists living with these threats. And it has increased a lot since with the rise of the Sweden Democrats, because these views are being validated, and many more people then would try to take action.
The parallel threat, I suppose you could say, in the internet world is cyber hacking, invasion of information, corporate information as well as government information.
Yeah.
How does this fit into your picture of the world of communication, false news, and threats to democratic societies?
You mean on the corporate level?
Well, on any level. I mean, just in the last few days, we've seen a massive, both corporate and government hack. And who's doing this? Why are they doing it? And where is it leading?
Well, the experts I'm talking to, the Swedish experts I'm talking to about this, would say that there are state actors working to destabilize and sometimes just showing their muscles when they're doing these massive attacks. I've lived, as we talked about, the closeness, the geographical closeness between Sweden and Russia. I've lived in a reality for a long time where my social media accounts are always spammed with these Russian psyops bots. I don't know, they don't seem to be super efficient, but Russia is also, and that's well established, sponsoring some of these right-wing organizations. So I think it's all this. I was talking about weaknesses in in the information infrastructure, and this is, of course, these massive hacker attacks we've seen the last days is just another example. It's not my area of expertise, I should say, but what I do know something about is the propaganda parts of it. So I'm just going to stop there, I think.
Thank you so much. It is very provocative and helpful to think about it through Swedish eyes. And I'm wondering, you were here during the Women's March, marches in the States and around the world, and that to me has been something of a hopeful step forward, along with the climate change and the other marches that have happened. And I'm wondering, for us, I work a lot in international development, international women's rights, and Sweden has always been a beacon in our work, along with Swedish SIDA, the International Development Agency of Sweden. And I'm wondering how you're seeing the impacts, what some of the feminists in Sweden are doing and thinking about these kinds of things, and the Swedish feminist movement in Sweden and what they are doing right now.
Thank you. Yes, I went to DC for the Women's March. It was a way of kind of regaining some balance after the election, I guess, for me and for many others. So we do have a feminist party in Sweden that were fairly close to making it into parliament. Actually, in the last election, they're still around. They're not doing a great job right now, kind of down in the polls. I think, so this is my very personal take, I think maybe they are too, I think if you want to build a broad, a party around feminist issues, you need to reach out and speak about broader issues such as the quality of healthcare or healthcare workers' situation at work. So I think their audience is too urban and maybe too narrow, and they haven't managed to broaden their alliance. I do think, I mean, there is very strong support in Sweden for things like our very generous paternal leave, for gender equality. We still have many, many issues. It's not an equal. I also live in patriarchy, but we have there is strong support for these, fundamental policies, and I don't see them being threatened. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about newspapers. For 20 years, we've been worried that we're going to lose newspapers. And if we look in Seattle, we lost the Post-Intelligencer, San Francisco, and a variety of different cities have lost the newspapers. Here we have a very wonderfully loved local newspaper, and I'm concerned about it, okay?
Yeah.
I'm also familiar with work that's been going on with Hybrid State and Skurup and Østed in Skåne, okay, where they're trying to, in fact, produce a hybrid between Facebook and existing newspapers. So if we want to take a look out 5, maybe 10 years, what do you see in Sweden as going to, in fact, be, the platform that you're going to be working from? Is it going to be a newspaper, or is it going to be something else?
I think in 5 years, so the newspaper I work for reaches about half the Swedish population. It's massive. So I think, it's a long story, but it's owned by a company that has found kind of a successful way of, so it has a classifieds company, it has a newspaper, so all this data flows around and they're able to capitalize on that in a very smart way. So I think my newspaper will be around in 5 years. I am very worried about local news, both in Sweden and elsewhere. And I think when you're talking about the crisis of journalism, that's maybe the biggest story, bigger than anything else. Because if people don't feel that their lives are being described or their local politicians are being scrutinized or investigated, that's also talking about lack of trust and losing trust. If the only journalists you see are, I don't know, a reporter from New York Times coming to your local community and then flying away and then describing your life to some other audience, that's not going to increase your trust in journalism. I do believe, and the problem is, again, that all the new advertising money is being sucked up by Facebook and Google. That's just a fact. And I don't know, but they should think about whether that's such a great idea in the long run, I think. I don't know what the answer is. I'm super worried about that.
You mentioned the fact that with being a journalist, you have to have some integrity. You have to be able to stand on the sidelines and report what is happening and keep yourself out of the picture, as it were. You're just there to report the facts. But at the same time, you say with the rise of false news or twisted stories, it has now pushed you or pushed journalists onto the front lines where they're now part of the battlefield. With that in mind, did I understood you correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, would it be the better way to combat the news or the fake news that's coming in is to have a more deeper psychological reporting done? This way you are taking what is being spent or what is said and talk about it in a way that brings out the psychology behind what's being said, so as to unmask the distrust and the twisted news. Wouldn't that be a better way of going about reporting the news?
So I had a discussion with people working at the Dartmouth today about political reporting, the college newspaper, and we were talking about, so what's the problem with political journalism or reporting? And I think from my perspective, I think it's problematic if you always describe politics as just a game. And one example is the excessive amount of reporting on polls and the numbers game, and Washington as this machine that is just about favors and corruption and doesn't really affect people's lives. And I think from my perspective, what is needed is to connect people's lives and social issues to politics and try to make that alive somehow. That it's about real things. It's not about who knows who or who is leading in the polls. And to your question about psychology, I don't know if unmasking. So, for example, the fact-checking doesn't seem to be working. I don't know if unmasking in terms of psychology, maybe, yeah. I don't know, I haven't thought about it. I think you have to write about things so people feel that they are represented and they are seen, and you write about real issues.
Right, just to give you a good example of that, a candidate was running and his promises that he's going to bring back certain coal jobs to the market. However, when you think about it, when you do a more in-depth reporting, you get to realize, why did those coal jobs go away? It wasn't because it's polluting the air and adding more dirt, but basically the fact that they have development of machines.
Yeah.
So where you would have 32 people digging for coal to produce a certain amount of coal per year or per day, you now have 12 people, but you have a better machine that is doing the same job, producing the same amount of work. So right away, you're able to use that kind of reporting to cut away, you could say, the rhetoric, and so as to really report what's really going on, and that's the facts.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I don't know, how long are we going on? Okay.
There was one word you have given, and it's general, about the precise role of the media, and particularly newspapers, in reporting science. I work on this, and I have a lot of trouble getting my scientific research into even an op-ed. For example, I'd like to find out how many people in this audience know that before Obama's election, in the United States, the healthcare system as a system per capita cost almost 2.5 times more than any other industrial country in the world. And yet in this country, for every 10,000 live births, 2 or 3, at least, infants died in the first year of life who would not have died elsewhere. Here we have people claiming the fetus, the fetus, the fetus, while live children whose mothers went through pregnancy and childbirth are dying. The media hasn't given us one word on this.
So all I can say about that is that European newspapers love to talk about exactly that the U.S. healthcare system is so much more expensive. So it's well reported in Europe. But apart from that, I guess I do, as I said, I think the job of journalism is to report more on the issues and less maybe on the politics as a game. So I can only agree with you.
I have a question, please. I wanted to know what you think is driving the polarization in Sweden, in the United States, besides economic dislocation, disruption, and abuses of the internet and how it's functioning. How long has this been happening? When did it happen? And what's the most poignant force behind it?
So that's a big question, and there are hundreds of experts on populism arguing about this back and forth. Is this about economics? Is it about culture issues? Is it about backlash against globalization? My own personal belief is that it's a mix of all of this. As I said, I have a background in economics. I tend to always look mostly at the underlying kind of structures of the economy, and I believe that a big part of the story is the disruption of how the economy works, and that old jobs are disappearing, new jobs are hard to find, people don't find their new place in this new world, and at the same time this explosion of inequalities which make people very resentful and feel that, you know, it's just not fair and something is very, very wrong. So I think it's just a combination of all of these things, and of course what drives this is technological disruption to a degree, and global trade.
Even the very well-to-do appear very polarized.
I'm sorry?
Even the very well-to-do appear very polarized.
Yes, yeah.
Not just those who suffered economic disruptions.
Well, I think if you think about a social contract, that's something that everybody more or less agrees on. Like, what are the basic principles of fairness in our society? How do we distribute this wealth that we create so that, you know, everybody is more or less content with what's happening? And that social contract, both here and in Europe, seems to kind of be breaking apart. That's my feeling.
So looking at trying to be, how can journalism be successful in community? If you take liberal journalism, progressive journalism, how can they be successful in reaching the masses? I look at I look in this country. I look at the wacko side. I look at the Alex Joneses, the Rush Limbaughs, the Breitbart News. They have tremendous followings, and I look in our country and this is anecdotal on my part, but I mean, who really can reach out to the people in this country are the Samantha Bees, the John Olivers, and the Stephen Colberts. So my question really is, do you think that we need to take your type of journalism and the journalism we think might be most effective to bring it down a notch, to bring it down more to the level of the masses? I hate to sound like an elitist.
No, that's an interesting question. So I used to run this super highbrow news magazine, which was targeted to a very well-educated, very snarky audience who loved it. And now I work for this mass publication that reaches half of the Swedish population, and I have to write for the masses, if you will. I mean, of course, Sweden is such a small scale, but at the same, I mean, we reach 5 million people every day, so that's a lot of people, however you measure it. And yes, I think something I've been thinking about this year is the obsession with what the New York Times and the Washington Post reports, because they are not, I love those publications. I read them every day. I think they do great journalism, but it doesn't matter that much because they're not being read by anyone anyway. So my point about Facebook is it's much, much, much more important how Facebook, changes their algorithms or what kind of content they decide to distribute than if the New York Times has a new op-ed writer or not. And that's an interesting issue in itself, but it's more important in my mind. And I mean, the big difference, of course, between Europe and the US is that we have strong public service media companies paid with. Everybody who has a TV in Sweden needs to pay a license fee who finances Swedish public broadcasting. So it's different.
On a very related note, I'm curious, there's been a lot of talk over the last year about the dissemination of false news by Google and Facebook and other platforms. But yet it seems that the group that is most likely to use those platforms to get the majority of their news is the least likely to sympathize with these right-wing groups. And in fact, it seems that the converse is actually true. The group that's the least likely to use the internet, least likely to use these platforms, are the exact group that is sympathizing with these right-wing groups. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say to that.
I'm sure that's true. On the other hand, I was looking at this report that was made by Harvard and MIT on the media land. They did a big election project on the use of social media in this election cycle, and what they saw I think you're right in terms of statistics, but what they also saw, what the impact of the Breitbart sphere in terms of agenda setting in mainstream media was much bigger than they had expected, and I guess much bigger than most people would think, just looking to size. And also just the fact, what they also observed was what we've been talking about, this extreme polarization, that you have one cluster of people who read the mainstream or liberal or the normal news, and then you have this other population who very insularly stays in the Breitbart universe. But you mean in terms of reaching out?
Well, I guess I'm just curious why, why does it seem to be the case that the people who use those outlets the most to get their news seem to be the ones that are least affected by this fake news that's disseminated all over these platforms?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I have no idea. I'm sorry.